Hello and welcome to Daily News Simplified. Here we have taken important articles and the news clippings that have appeared in the Hindu newspaper, Delhi edition. Also, we have taken a mains practice question keeping in mind the upcoming mains examination. The important articles of the discussion are listed on your screen. Now moving on with the next article of the day, the article is featured on page 10 of the Hindu and again talks about the issue of MSP. Now the topic of MSP, what was the purpose behind introduction of minimum support price? Its contribution has already been discussed in detail by Jatin sir in the previous DNS videos. During this discussion, we'll focus ourselves on the aspect regarding legalization of the MSP as the demand has been laid down by the farmers, and we'll also try to understand what will be the functional challenges while implementing the MSP. Now, if you look at the GS3 syllabus, you can see that the issues related to direct and indirect farm subsidies, minimum support price, PDS are directly mentioned in the syllabus, and these has been asked in mains as well as the prelims examination, as a question related to MSP was seen in prelims 2020. Now the article is in news because of the ineffective implementation of the MSP and of the issue of non-procurement of all the crops at the MSP as one of the main concern of the farmers. If we go in a brief introduction, MSP today does not enjoy a statutory recognition. We'll try to understand what is the need for legalization of MSP today. Now the first need or the first thing that explains the need for legalization of MSP is the enhancement that it will produce in the income level of the farmer. As presently, the procurement is quite limited, as well as it is also limited to certain geographical regions. And most of the farmers currently sell their commodities below the MSPs in the open market. Thus, the legalization of MSP will ensure that the farm produce us at a legalized MSP price, which will ensure better price for the farmers. The second thing that the MSP legalization will do is that it will promote crop diversification. As presently, only 3 to 4 crops, which includes wheat, paddy, cotton, and sometimes the pulses, are procured at MSP, while the remaining crops are being procured much below the MSP rate. And such absence of any dependable or assured market mechanism leads to issue of monocropping or favor the production of crops that are offered under MSP. Thus, the legalization of MSP for all the crops will ensure that diversification happens at the same time. But legalization of MSP also has its certain challenges and concern associated with it. The first challenge or the concern that can be associated with the legalization of MSP is that it will go against the interest of the farmers, as the legalization of MSP may invite an environmental cost, as the focus can be on the overproduction of rice, of wheat, which will definitely invite environmental cost in the form of declining soil fertility or declining levels of groundwater, and will ultimately go against the interest of the farmers for whom the legalization is being made. Now the second factor or the second challenge in the legalization of MSP is that it will adversely impact the Indian economy. It will impact the Indian economy because there will be higher cost of procurement due to the statutory or the legalized status of MSP, which will in turn increase the food prices, leading in turn to inflation in the market. Also at the same time, it will impact the export sector of the economy, as now the products will not be export competitive, meaning thereby the export competitiveness due to increased price will also reduce. The next major challenge of legalization of MSP will be the financing needs, as if the government has to procure all the 23 crops at MSP, it would amount to a large and the sizable part of government's budget and may hamper with the fiscal deficit targets set by the government for the same purpose. It will also lead to unsustainable food grain management policy in India, as it has been seen with the example of food subsidy bill or the food security bill, which has led to increased procurement But due to the increased procurement, this has also led to the surplus buffer stocks, which is leading to higher storage cost, as well as also causing wastages in this buffer stock. And the legalization of MSP will further worsen the scenario that has already been worsened by the Food Security Bill. The next challenge that the MSP will pose is the administrative challenge, as there is a lack of government machinery to ensure such a large scale procurement of food grains. It will also go against the WTO agreement on agriculture, and as the limit on subsidies can be violated and India can be challenged by other countries at the WTO. Further, there is also a fear that the legalization of MSP will further promote the inequality. As we have seen that the procurement of MSP is limited, and that too is limited to certain geographical areas like that of Punjab, Haryana and Madhya Pradesh. And the legalization of MSP could further worsen the socio-economic inequality that is already prevalent in the Indian agriculture sector. At the last, the legalization of MSP will go against the concept of free market economy, as in any free market economy, the prices of goods as well as services that are produced in the country are decided by the market forces and not by the state or the government. And thus, the government intervention, though intended with a noble cause, will ultimately lead to price distortion and affect the sentiments of a free market economy. So these were the challenges and the concerns that were associated with the legalization of MSP. Now, using the same article on the MSP, we have framed a question in the mains test series of Rao's IAS, where we have tried to explore the other option other than MSP in the form of input support scheme. For example, the schemes like PM Kisan or the Raitu Bandhu scheme, etc. Through this question, we will try to understand how we should write the answer for the same, as the question here says, discuss the needs as well as the limitations of the input support scheme in the agricultural sector in India, and also suggest the measures to overcome their limitation. So the question basically here has three parts. The first thing is the need for the input support scheme. The second part deals with the limitations of the input support scheme. And the third part deals with the measures that are to be adopted to overcome the limitations under it. So we have to address all the three subparts while writing the answer in about 250 words. Now, in our introduction, we will briefly describe that the central or the state government offers the input support scheme, wherein the financial support to land-owning farmers are extended at the beginning of the crop seasons, and this is primarily done through DBT, that is the direct benefit transfer method. For example, under the central government it is PM Kisan, and under the state government we can take the example of Raitu Bandhu scheme. So this is how we will start our answer. Now moving on with the first part, that what is the need for the input support scheme. The first need of the input support scheme is that it will tackle the problem of lack of access to institutional credit, as the RBI's financial inclusion report suggests that more than 60% of the marginal farmers' credit comes from the informal sources, and thus there is a need for this input support scheme to reduce the dependence of marginal farmer on the informal sources of credit. The second need for the input support scheme is that it will offer a more effective solution than the debt waiver, as it will not impact the credit culture in India and will not impose a moral hazard on the farmers. The third need for input support scheme is that they are crop neutral. Unlike the schemes like that of minimum support price, which favors certain crops like that of wheat, rice that we have already discussed, input support scheme on the other hand basically are crop neutral, and thus will also lead to diversification. Further, another major advantage of input support scheme is that it will go beyond the purview of WTO, meaning thereby the input support schemes do not fall under the ember box of WTO and hence will not cross the agreement on agriculture limit. And the fifth major need in the favor of input support scheme is that it will lead to better price realization for the farmers, as farmers still today prefer selling their produce to traders or commission agents. And the primary reason behind the farmers selling their produce to traders or the commission agent is the input credit that is extended by these traders or the commission agents to the farmers. And it is in this regard that the farmers fail to realize the price. However, if we provide the input support scheme, the farmers' dependence on the traders and the commission agent will reduce, and hence there will be better price realization and remunerative prices for the farmers. Now that we have addressed the first part of our question, the second part is related to the limitations of the input support scheme. Now, the first limitation is that it will offer insufficient support, because the financial support that is given under these schemes are often insufficient to meet the input cost of the farmers. The second challenge that the input support scheme will face is the identification of beneficiaries, as there is a lack of digitalization of land records and hence the identification becomes difficult. Further, the major tenants and the sharecroppers in the agricultural sectors are not covered under the scheme, and it also becomes one of the critical challenges as a major chunk also practices tenant and sharecropping as a mode of their livelihood. Further, the input support scheme is also marred with the challenge of inefficient disbursement, as it has been seen that banks often use these deposits, that is the money that is being deposited in the account of beneficiaries by the government, is utilized by the banks to cover against the past liabilities of the farmers. There is also a fear that the agriculture input support scheme will give rise to the inefficient use of inputs such as fertilizer and water. Further, the misuse of the input money that is guaranteed through DBT under the input support scheme is often misused. For example, the money that has been promised under the input support scheme are utilized by farmers for consumption of alcohol, and hence the input money is misutilized. And last but not the least, this input support scheme is not a permanent solution to the problem of the farming crisis in India, as the farming crisis in India is challenged by various fundamental issues that needs to be. Now that we have addressed two parts of our question, the last part of the question is the way forward that needs to be suggested to counter this problem. And in the way forward, we'll write the points like need for digitalization of land record. Secondly, we can also write about the need for swift implementation of Model Tenancy Act, providing input support in kind rather than cash, and the greater need to improve the overall agricultural infrastructure and introduce marketing reforms, and also to provide agricultural insurance to every farm in the country. So with this, we have seen how a question related to similar concept like that of subsidy scheme offered by the government can be asked in the mains examination that is upcoming, and we have tackled the issue of input support scheme with the need, limitation, and also the way forward that can be suggested to solve the problem. Moving on to the next article of the day, the article has featured on page 15 of the Hindu and basically talks about the international organization UNESCO. Now the article mentions that the UN Cultural and Scientific Agency, that is the UNESCO, has announced that United States is planning to rejoin and pay more than $600 million in back dues after a decade-long dispute which was sparked by the UNESCO decision to include Palestine as its member. Now, the analysts believe that the decision is motivated by the concern that China is filling the gap which was left by US in the UNESCO policy making. It is to be remembered that the US as well as the Israel has stopped funding UNESCO after it voted to include Palestine as a member state in 2011. And it was during the Trump administration in 2017 that USA decided to withdraw, citing anti-Israel bias and management issues within the working of UNESCO. Before leaving, US contributed to the largest amount in the total funding of UNESCO, which was about the tune of 22% of the total funding. Now, before starting our discussion, we should have a brief background about the UNESCO. Now, the background of the UNESCO can be traced back to the early 1940s. That is, in 1942, the governments of the European countries, which were collectively confronting the Germany and its allies, met in United Kingdom for what came to be known as Conference of Allied Ministers of Education, that is CAME. And it was on the proposal of this CAME, that is Conference of Allied Ministers of Education, a United Nations conference for the establishment of educational and cultural organization was convened in 1945. Now, the purpose of UNESCO is quite clear. It was originally founded to focus on the issue of rebuilding school, libraries, museums that had been destroyed in Europe during the World War II. And since then, the activities of UNESCO has been targeted toward these efforts. It is also to be remembered that in 1972, the UNESCO sponsored an international agreement to establish of what we today know as World Heritage List of cultural sites and the natural areas that would enjoy the government protection. So this was the basic understanding behind UNESCO. Now, the next thing to understand is the area of specialization in which the UNESCO works. And it is broadly 8 areas that where the UNESCO work. The first is the education, which is the core mission of UNESCO, which aim to transform lives through education in order to foster peace as well as to end poverty. And under the SDG 4, that is the Sustainable Development Goal 4, it has been given the responsibility of leading the global education agenda. Next in the area of specialization under UNESCO is the natural sciences to solve the pressing economic, social and the environmental problem that the world currently faces. Ocean sciences is another area of specialization where UNESCO works in. Apart from this, social and human sciences, a focus on culture, communication and information, a special focus on Africa and gender equality are among the 2 prominent global priorities of UNESCO, and both have been given due attention along with the Sustainable Development Goal and the Agenda for the Development in African Union, as well as to eliminate all kinds of assault on women and to enhance their basic literacy skill related to them. So now that we have seen about the history of UNESCO and the areas of specialization, the next focus that is of key importance for us is the membership of the UNESCO. And the membership of the UNESCO is governed by primarily 2 things. First, it is governed by the Constitution of UNESCO, and apart from that, it is also governed by the rules of procedure of the General Conference. It is to be remembered that the membership of United Nations carries with it the right to the membership of UNESCO, meaning thereby a country being a member of United Nations has the right to acquire the membership of UNESCO. This brings us to the next question, that the countries who are not the member of United Nations can also be admitted to UNESCO if they are recommended by executive board and by a 2/3 majority vote of General Conference. Now the next thing, apart from the membership and the rules for non-members of the UN, is the funding mechanism that can be asked. Now, it is to be remembered that the UNESCO gets its funding from the contribution by the member states, which is known as the assessed contribution, and also through voluntary contribution, fundraising, and other smaller sources of funding. So, the primary method of financing of UNESCO is through the assessed contribution by the member states and the voluntary contributions. Now, under the assessed contribution, each member state pays a percentage of the overall agreed budget, which is based upon their overall burden share that is set for the United Nations families. So basically, a percentage of contribution which they are making in the United Nations family is taken as a percentage. Apart from the contribution to the UNESCO funding is specifically also done for the conservation of World Heritage Sites, which are included under the World Heritage Fund. And the World Heritage Fund also gets the obligatory contribution from the member country and similarly the voluntary contributions. So the next in line to understand is the World Heritage Fund. The fund provides for $4 million annually, which are to support activities when requested by the state parties in need of international assistance. Meaning thereby, when the state parties ask for the assistance of their World Heritage sites, funding is provided to them from the World Heritage Fund. And the World Heritage Fund, we have already seen, gets its funding from compulsory and the voluntary contribution made by the state parties as well as the private donations. The next important thing to understand about UNESCO is the Rapid Response Facility. Now, by the very name, it is clear. The Rapid Response Facility is a small grants program. Basically, it is a small grants program which is jointly operated by the UNESCO World Heritage Center, United Nations Foundation, and Fauna and Flora International. And what the Rapid Response Facility aims to do? It aims to protect natural World Heritage sites in the time of crisis. So basically, in the time of crisis which requires a swift response, a Rapid Response Facility which has a small grant program under it is utilized. This brings us to the last part of our discussion on UNESCO, is the important report that it produces and its relation with India. The first important report that the UNESCO produces is the Global Education and Monitoring Report. The next important report that it produces is the Global Ocean Science Report. With regard to India, UNESCO also produces State of Education Report for India, that is the children with disabilities. And a report that can be seems to be confusing is the World Trend in Freedom of Expression and the Media Development is also released by UNESCO. India has joined the organization in 1946 and participates currently in 19 of its conventions. Apart from that, India has 40 UNESCO World Heritage Sites which belongs to cultural, natural and the mixed sites. So with this, we have understood how UNESCO came into existence, what are the various areas of specialization under UNESCO. We have also learned about the membership of the UNESCO, how the membership is granted by constitution and the rules of procedure of the General Conference, how the membership can be extended to a non-member of the UN. We have also seen the funding mechanism where we have understood the assessed contribution based on the percentage of agreed budget and their contribution in the United Nations family. And we have also read about the World Heritage Fund and their obligatory and voluntary contribution. Moving on to the next article of the day, the article is featured on page 14 of the Hindu and basically talks about a report that has been given by the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute or the SIPRI. Now the report talks about that China has increased its nuclear arsenal to 410 nuclear warheads in January 2023, which is up from 350 in 2022. And it also explains that China could potentially have at least as many intercontinental ballistic missiles as possessed by US and that of Russia. Now the report also highlights the scenario of India and Pakistan. The report mentions that the India and Pakistan have also expanded their nuclear arsenal and continues to develop new types of nuclear delivery system in 2022. The report also mentions that while the Pakistan remains the main focus of India's nuclear deterrent, India appears to be placing its growing emphasis on longer range weapons, including those reaching of the target across China. Now the topic is basically about the expansion of arms, and we have to cover it under the arms control. Now arms control forms an important topic from the prelims perspective. And UPSC in the prelims examination under the IR section has asked questions related to various armed treaties that were in news. Through this article, we'll try to cover all the armed control treaties that are of importance such that they are comprehensively covered. The first trade treaty that is important is related to Hague Code of Conduct related to the ballistic missile proliferation. Now this treaty was formally known as the International Code of Conduct and was adopted at an international conference in Hague, which was held in 2002. And the primary motive of this Hague Code of Conduct is to curb the ballistic missile proliferation worldwide and to delegitimize such proliferation further. It is to be known that the Hague Code of Conduct does not call for the destruction of any missiles. It is simply an agreement between the states on how they should conduct their trade in missile. Meaning thereby, it does not put an obligation for the state to go for destruction. Rather, how the trade will be conducted in case of ballistic missile. Another important mention about the treaty is its relation with the MTCR or the Missile Technology Control Regime, which also forms an important treaty of arms control. The Hague Code of Conduct in its relation with MTCR is to supplement the MTCR in its effort of arms control, but the membership of Hague Code of Conduct is not restricted to that of MTCR. Meaning thereby, though Hague Code of Conduct is there to supplement MTCR, the membership of Hague Code of Conduct can go beyond MTCR also. So this was the first arm control treaty that we need to cover. Moving on to the second arm control treaty is the MTCR only, that is the Missile Technology Control Regime. And the most particular or the peculiar point about the MTCR is basically it is not a treaty. And further, it does not impose any legally binding obligation on the partners or the member state. Rather than it is an informal political understanding among the states that seek to limit the proliferation of missiles and their technology. Now the MTCR, as we have seen, Hague Code of Conduct came into existence in 2002 to supplement MTCR. MTCR predates Hague Code of Conduct and was formed in 1987 by the G7 industrialized country, which consists of Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, UK and the United States, and was primarily focused to address the increasing proliferation of nuclear weapons by addressing the delivery system for such weapons. Now, after its launch, another thing to understand about the MTCR is, though primarily it was targeted for the nuclear weapons delivery, later on in 1992, the horizon of the treaty was expanded to cover all type of weapons of mass destruction, that is nuclear, chemical as well as the biological weapons were also covered under the ambit of MTCR. And the regime seeks to control the export of goods and technology that could make a contribution to the delivery system. So this Missile Technology Control Regime or the MTCR has particular focus on the rockets and the unmanned aerial vehicles or the UAVs, which are capable of delivering a payload of at least 500 kg and a range of at least 300 km. And before India acceded to this treaty in 2016, it was one of the prime reasons that why India has kept the range of BrahMos missile that was developed in coordination with Russia to 290 kilometer only. So what we have learned is that it is not a treaty, does not impose any legally binding obligation, covers rockets and UAVs. The range as well as the payload has also been defined, covers nuclear as well as all other methods as well as all other weapons of mass destruction, and India has been a member since 2016. Now moving on to the next important step in controlling the arms trade is the Nuclear Supplier Group or the NSG. Now NSG basically is a export control regime, and it is a group of nuclear supplier countries that seek to prevent nuclear proliferation. And how do they do so? They do so by controlling the export of materials, equipments, and the technology that can be used to manufacture nuclear weapons. Meaning thereby, the Nuclear Supplier Group controls the export of not only the nuclear material but also equipments as well as the technology. And currently it has 48 participating governments under its ambit. Now, the NSG met for the first time in 1975 in London, and it is also popularly known as the London Club. The grouping also provides for two sets of guidelines. The first set of guidelines govern the export of items that are designed or prepared for nuclear use, while the other set of guidelines is regarding the dual use control, which governs nuclear as well as non-nuclear application. It is to be understood that India is not a part of this grouping. UPSC in the prelims examination has already asked a question on this pattern. So this highlights the importance of such groupings and the arms control treaties that are present. Now moving on with the next treaty that is of considerable importance is the Wassenaar Arrangement. Now Wassenaar Arrangement deals with the conventional arms as well as the dual use goods and technology and was reached in 1995 but became operational in 1996. Now the initial elements of the Wassenaar Arrangement talked about the basic mechanism of information exchange, which consists of munition list, that is small arms, light weapon, tanks and other military armed vehicles are covered under the munition list. And in the field of dual use goods and technologies like that of sensors, lasers, propulsion system, avionics and several other items are also covered. Now this brings us to the question that who are the members of the Wassenaar Arrangement? So the criteria for the membership of Wassenaar Arrangement is that country must be a producer or exporter of arms to become a member of this grouping. And these controls are implemented via the national legislation, meaning thereby the sole responsibility of implementation lies with the each member country. It is to be noted that two changes have been made in the Wassenaar Arrangement. After the 9/11 attacks that were carried out in US, there has been a revision to the Wassenaar Arrangement and the non-state actors provision has been added to it. And apart from that, in 2013, to cater to the surveillance and intelligence gathering software, they were included under the list of dual use technology as intrusive software. So basically, intrusive software is a part of dual use technology, and non-state actor provision has also been added to the Wassenaar Arrangement. And why this Wassenaar Arrangement is important particularly for India? Because India became the 42nd member country to be part of Wassenaar Arrangement and has recently acquired the chairmanship of the same. So this is the importance of Wassenaar Arrangement. Moving on to the next treaty that is of considerable importance is the Australia Group. Now Australia Group is also an informal arrangement which deals with minimizing the risk that is associated with the chemical and the biological weapons. And how do the Australia Group manages to do so? It uses a licensing measure to ensure that the exports of certain chemical, biological, and the dual use chemical and biological manufacturing facilities do not contribute to the spread of CBW or the chemical and biological weapons. Meaning thereby there is a use of licensing measures to control the exports of agents, technologies to restrict the spread. Now, it is to be understood here again that the participants in the Australia group do not undertake any legally binding obligation under it. And there are two more provisions that are important with regard to the Australia group. One is the provision of no undercut, and second is that of catch-all. In the no undercut provision, any member of the group, that is the Australia group, who is considering to make an export to any other state which has already been denied an export by any other member of the group, needs to first consult with the member state before approving the export. Meaning thereby, suppose country A and C are the part of Australia group. Now the country A wishes to supply exports to country B. But country C, who is also the part of Australia group, has earlier denied such exports to country B due to its credential. In such a scenario, it is the duty of country A to first consult country C before making or approving the export. The second provision is related to the catch-all, and it says that states should halt all the exports that could be used by the importers in CBW weapon program, regardless whether the export is on group's control list or not. So whether the export is on the control list or not, anything that can be used by the importers to make chemical or biological weapons should be restricted. Moving on with the next two treaties that are the last part of our treaties is the New START treaty, which has recently came to an end. And it was a treaty that was signed between United States and Russian Federation with the focus on further reduction and limitation of strategic offensive arms. It was a successor of the START treaty or START framework of 1991. The treaty in focus today is that of Arms Trade Treaty. Now the Arms Trade Treaty has been recently signed in 2014 and has currently 110 state parts. What the Arms Trade Treaty wishes to do is to regulate the international trade in conventional arms, to prevent illicit trade and diversion of conventional arms by establishing international standards. It is to be remembered that India is not the party of the agreement. However, India's neighbor China has ratified the Arms Trade Treaty. So with this, we have covered all the important arms control treaty that can be asked in the prelims examination. We have read about the Arms Trade Treaty that is in news. We have also read about the Australia group and the informal arrangement that it proposes to counter chemical and the biological weapons. We have also read about the Wassenaar arrangement, which particularly targets the conventional arm and the dual use goods and technology. We have also seen about the nuclear supplier group that seeks to control the export of materials, equipment or technology that can be used to manufacture nuclear weapons. And in the very beginning, we have also seen the Missile Technology Control Regime or the MTCR and the Hague Code of Conduct that was brought in to supplement the same.